Okay, we are back with episode 3 in this Bible study series. And we're on to the next page now. We're still in the same book that we were covering in episode 2, I believe it was. And let's keep going. So now we're going to be talking about a tribe called the Allens. And we're going to get a description of what these Allens look like. And it turns out we're going to learn that these Allens are related to the Scythians. And we're going to learn a lot more. So let's get going. Of this blue-eyed and red-haired, rosy-cheeked race is but the expansion of the restless and roving race of Allens, or as the Romans called them, Asiatic Scythians. So the Romans classified these people as Scythians as well. Let's keep going. In the 2nd century, the Allens, between the Don and the Dnieper, attacked the Romans. Okay, they attacked the Romans. And we're going to look later on in this series how the Romans made ancient depictions of a lot of these battles against these barbarian tribes. And that is one of the ways we're able to see what these people look like. Okay, let's keep going. The Dnieper attacked the Romans on the Danube. And in the 3rd century, the Goths, we're going to learn about them later on, aligned themselves with the Alans, being of the same stock. Let's say that again, being of the same stock. Let's keep going. And after the fall of the Gothic Empire, a part of the Alans followed the Vandals into Spain and into Africa. The larger part of these Western Alans, however, had their habitation between the Azov and the Caspian. Let's keep going. Okay, we're now at page 154. Let's get started here. Or the Goths, their most celebrated branches in the days of Caesar. Okay, days of Caesar. This is very important because we know the Roman Empire was ruling during the time of Christ. And we know that during the time of Christ, Esau is in Arabia and he's swarthy. So during the same time period, we have white people already in Europe. Let's keep going. In the days of Caesar, the most advanced tribes of the Goths, or Geti, were known to the Romans by the name of Germans. They occupied all the continent but the Cimbric Peninsula and had reached even past the Rhine. The Anglo-Saxons are derived from them. Some of these Scythians were the descendants of Magog. Okay? Descendants of Magog. Let's keep going. For this, we have the authority of Jewish historian Josephus, who says Gomer founded those whom the Greeks now call Galati, but were then called Gomerites. Okay, this is very important to understand. So all these terms are now modern. Scythians, Goths, all that type of stuff. The further you go back into history, people were called by their biblical names that we see in the scripture. But what happened was the Romans and the Greeks started renaming the peoples of the world to names they made up instead of sticking to the biblical names. And as for Josephus, he was a historian who lived during the same time period as Paul the Apostle. And many One West Camp Israelites use his sources. So we shouldn't have any problem with quoting Josephus here. Gomer founded those whom the Greeks now call Galati, but were then called Gomerites. Magog founded those that from him were called Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called Scythians. See, there's the connection. Okay, we're going to get a little bit down to the bottom of the page now because there's some very interesting stuff that I would like to read to you guys. Among these people who after his day were loosely called Scythians, he asserts that there were distinct races, while Josephus, speaking of the same diverse classes, calls them all Scythians and gives Magog as their seer. Modern times have disclosed 3 races above the Scythians, proper of Herodias: the Slav nations, the Musavkos nations, sorry, that's butchered on that one, the Finns, and the Kugris, or ancient Turks. Okay, I really want to mention the Slavs because we're going to get into it later, but Magog is going to play a huge role in end times prophecy. The Magogites are. And we can see that what we call modern day Slavs come from Japheth, or are related to the Scythian peoples. So all these people in history, to be, Vladimir Lenin or Putin or whatever, they come from the Scythians. And we are going to learn even more that the modern day Russian people, Soviet Union, those are Scythians. And the Scythians actually settled in Russia. And as I mentioned before, we actually have DNA. And we're going to link these ancient peoples to the modern people in the land now with DNA. So we have the best of both worlds here. We have the ancient depictions, we have the ancient writings, and we have DNA. So we're going to see that the blood types of these ancient barbarian tribes, the Scythians, who settled in Russia during that time period, are still there today. And that's when you're talking about Soviet Union and all that type of stuff, 1945, that's who is there. And we know that to be the case because we're going to see later on in the scripture that the scripture also identifies these Russians as Magog, which the Scythians come from. This is getting really deep now. Okay, here's a source I found online, which I'm going to link up with the ancient depiction that I have, and also what we read about the Scythians being what we call Slavs. Herodias, however, defines Scythians, as I will do here, as the inhabitants of the steppes of what is now Ukraine and a small part of modern-day Russia between the 7th and 3rd century BCE, having migrated there previously from Central Asia and settled in the land the Greeks called Scythia. It was called Scythia, and I want you to look at the Central Asian part. Remember what we were talking about in episode 2, where the so-called Caucasian, the so-called white man, is on a DNA level and an appearance level way closer to Japanese and South Korean people than he is to the Negro. So when we talk about, Esau's the white man and all those, one West Camp doctrines, Esau was the twin brother of Jacob. And as we've seen in the Unmasked Edomite series, all of those nations in the land of Canaan were Negro types, especially Esau. So Esau looked like his twin brother. They were both black men. But when you look at the white man and you try and put him in the Esau bucket, he looks nothing like Jacob. But he looks a lot like the Asian peoples. But there we go. He came from Central Asia. Remember we learned about the white folks living near the Chinese during the time period where the events in Nehemiah were taking place? This is very important. But let's look at what has been uncovered in Ukraine. So what you're looking at is a Greek vase from the 4th century BC that was actually dug up in Crimea, Ukraine. So what we have here is a Scythian depiction on this vase that was dug up in Crimea. Why would this be in Crimea if the people weren't there? We just read that the people lived there, and now we have Scythian artifacts in Ukraine. But it's going to get deeper than this. So staying out of politics, because I personally believe that unless it lines up with Bible prophecy, politics have no space in the Bible community because all they do is divide people. And I know that there's believers who are in the covenant of the Most High Yah all over the world, no matter it be in Russia or Ukraine. So I'm not here to talk about the conflict of the war and all that type of stuff and try and divide people even further. But one thing I will say is when putting together this lesson, I remember a few months ago there was a news article that was popping up that was stating that the Russians and the Ukrainians were fighting over Scythian artifacts. And that stuck out really big to me, that the Russians and the Ukrainians see value in Scythian history. And it's all lining up now. We have the ancient depictions, we have the ancient locations, we have the ancient writings, and we have the locations, I think I mentioned that already. And now we have in a modern day conflict. Usually when you're in a war and you're going to take over a country or whatever, you usually take the fuel, you take the water, you maybe take the cattle. But the Ukrainians and the Russians hold Scythian history very dear to them. And the question is, why? If that was not them, why would they care? You look at America, and the Americans are not attached to Native American history because that's not them. They don't care. They're not feeling heart warmth about Mexican history. They don't care. So the fact that during a war zone, the Ukrainians and the Russians are going back and forth trying to seize Scythian artifacts is even more evidence here. Because just think about it. Okay, I told you guys we were going to get into DNA. Now it's going to get super crazy. Now, like I mentioned in past videos and Bible study series I've done, a lot of people do not accept DNA. They say that the whole thing is false. They say that it's not historically accurate. It's a lie. And some of that is true. But there's a lot of Israelites out there, though, specifically ones in the One West Camp doctrine, who use DNA to prove their points. They'll go onto the internet and they'll be like, see, this is my Moorish DNA. And, this is my Sephardic Jew DNA. And there are points of DNA that is historically accurate and can be used with the scripture. For example, Table of Nations stuff, which is what I'm doing right here. I'm not trying to look at a DNA pool and try and find out who King Solomon's great grandson is. We're using this to identify a people. And one thing I will say, which is very interesting, and I covered this in the Unmasking the Edomite series, is the so-called white man, his blood is on a completely different number chart than the Negro. If he was Esau, the twin brother, it would be a match. But there is no match. Right here we have the Iron Age Scythians. The Iron Age Scythians were of the type mostly R1A. Let's see if we can find R1A still today. Take a look at this. We have a map of all of the different countries in Europe. And look what the vast majority of the DNA for Russia and Ukraine is. R1A. Just like the Iron Age Scythians. So now, all of the sources are starting to click together. It's all matching. So now we have the writings, the depictions, we have the locations, and now the blood is lining up.